morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I know we've got people calling in from as far afield as Mississippi to Melbourne. So at whatever time of the day it is for you, I wish you all the best for it. Welcome to this European Aviation Conference GARS co-hosted event where we're looking at, this is the first in a series of webinars, where we're looking at recent books on aviation management and aviation economics, but economics very much from a management rather than an academic perspective. We're also looking at regulation of aviation, which I think falls into the same sort of category in all honesty. This week is a week where we're simply, I say simply, I wish I hadn't, this is a week where we are simply going to go through the books that we're going to look at in some depth in the next few weeks. Indeed, it's a series of 6, plus this one, of course, 7, ongoing webinars, same time, same place for the next 6 weeks. But we're going to just very gently introduce each of the books as we go through today. The books, just to remind you all, there's Air Traffic Management Principles, Performance and Markets by Marina, and I always mispronounce Marina's name. No, I won't even try, by Marina. Then we're going to look at Airport Economics, a book, another book published, I should add, by Rutledge. Peter Forsyth, Cahal Guillemay, and Hans-Martin Neumeyer wrote that book, and we'll be talking about that. Then we get to the pinnacle, which is, of course, Barry Humphrey's book, The Regulation of Air Transport, another Rutledge book. And then Peter, Jürgen, Hans-Martin, Eric Pells, Daniel Bigger, Nicole Adler, and Cahal again wrote a book about benchmarking and should we be using benchmarking to regulate airports? In other words, what's the economic, how do we do economic regulation for something like an airport? And Mike Brown will then talk to us in another Rutledge book about that. Sorry, I should add the airport regulation one is a Springer book. Mike Brown is here today as well also, and we will be looking very shortly at his book about airport planning, another very relevant topic, of course. And then finally, David Starkey, who is writing about airport enterprises, aerotropolises, things like that. David is in the United Kingdom, so you'll understand he has precisely zero infrastructure and consequently doesn't have an internet connection. So I think Hans-Martin will come in as a pinch hitter and talk about David's book today, and that gives us 6 weeks to work out how we can get him to somewhere safe and valuable where he can perhaps find some halfway decent infrastructure, although that's quite a big challenge, of course. So that's me to make an introduction, but I'm going to ask each of the authors, or at least one representative of each author team, if they'd be so kind as to introduce their book for just a few moments. So Marina, you're next off in that, or you're first off in that you're also, this will be the first book we talk about in detail next week. So if you'd be so kind as to just tell us what your book's about and why you think we should have a book like this.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining. We have a lot of books published this year, I think, which is fantastic for the academic society. So my book on air traffic management principles, performance, and markets, it's a long journey. I wrote that book because when I was doing my PhD, there weren't many books published that they look at air traffic control structure and markets, and I thought there is a very big gap there. And in an attempt to help new people going into this game to understand a little bit better what is happening. So my book has 14 contributors, 12 chapters. Each chapter they cover a different topic. Overall, the categories, the themes are principles, performance, and markets. It brings together academia and industry. So some of the contributors we have, for instance, Francois Huet, who is a director in Borealis Alliance, Peter Kearney, the CEO of AirNav, the Irish ANSP, a number of academics, some of them also here today, like Peter Forsyth and Hans-Martin Griemeyer, Frank Vichert, who wrote a book chapter on charges, Anna Tomova, and I say that with shame, one of the few female contributors to my book, because that's another issue that we see in the academic society and the industry, the female representation. Anyway. So this book, I think it's interesting to read because there are a few books published, like Margaret's book, another one calling out another fantastic book in this area, but there aren't that many. And I think this book overall, it tries to merge academia with industry, something that's also the principle of the European Aviation Conference Institute. It's relatively easy to read, 260 pages. It covers different topics, the performance regulation like environmental performance, capacity, safety, security, structure, business models, unbundling of air navigation services, and also looking at remote hours, a new technological concept for airspace performance. So that's in short. I'm the first one who will have the webinar, so you're very much invited next Monday, the same time, the same place as Andrew said, and very generously hosted by him and GARS and EAC. I hope, Andrew, I'm within my time frame, giving space for the other fantastic contributors to explain and their books.
Well, Marie, thank you. You have, well done, very well done. Let me ask you a very simple question. If I worked for an airline, why would I buy your book? Why would I want to read your book?
Yeah, very simply, because all the airlines are complaining about the airspace capacity, and through this book, they understand how NSPs work, or how they should work, or how they don't work. And it's not only the capacity is just an example, also the route charges and the environmental performance, and bringing together in a single book their traffic control, business management, and concepts.
But have you pitched the book towards people who already work in air traffic control, or people who would, or sorry, air traffic management, as we call it these days, or have we, or is it actually aimed at people who need to interface with ATM?
Yeah, so it's not a technical book. So it's more about those who have a general understanding on how ATC works. There are some chapters that they introduce the topic at the beginning, and then it goes in more details on specific areas. So I will say it is for people who work in policy, management, and not necessarily in technical areas like ANS. They're not ATSEPs and controllers. But for them, I think it will also support them, because it gives them a wider understanding of the market. Right.
So one last question and then we'll move on. But in terms of the ecosystem of aviation, how important do you think ATM is?
The most important.
The most important.
The most important. Maybe I'm a little bit biased. And the reason that I'm saying that is, when you ask somebody to describe air transport, they will say an airport and an airline. An airport and an airline wouldn't be there if ANS wasn't there. So it's a valuable part of the system that many times we ignore it. Okay, maybe exaggerate that it is the most important, because again, I'm a little bit biased, but it is a very critical part of the aviation system that now it starts gaining a little bit of attention from the press and also from the policy making.
Thank you. And I said one last question, and I'm going to ask you another last question. How do we get a copy of your book?
So in the webinar next time, I'm going to share also a discount code. You can find that obviously in Rootlet's website, Amazon. If you Google it, you're going to find it. But I will say that the best way of buying it is joining the next webinar, where we're going to share also a discount code, and then you can get it with a very generous discount. Also, I need to highlight something, Andrew, is that earnings from the book, they go to Orbis. Orbis is an NGO for fighting avoidable blindness. Thank you very much, Andrew. You contributed to that fantastic cause. Thanks.
So it's a question, of course, and available both in hard copy and e-copy, I assume. These are questions I'll put to everyone, of course. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. And obviously, I like ATM because I find it really easy to spell. The second book we're going to talk about, moving on, because we really don't have a lot of time, so let's do that, is let's now turn to airport economics. And this is another recent Rutledge book written by Peter Forsyth, Cathal Guillemet, and Hans Martin himself. So obviously this is absolutely the A-team. I think, Cathal, you're talking about this book, am I right?
Yes, that's correct. I'll just share a screen with a couple of slides here.
Oh, thank you.
All going well?
Remembering you've only got 5 minutes.
Oh, I do. There's no screen sharing, it seems.
Right. Well, let's just move on, if we may, rather than
we can move
spend too
on.
much time on this.
So look, this is a book on airport economics, as it says. We're in the interesting position where I think it's true that for half a century there were no books on airport economics. And we've had 2 now in the space of about 4 weeks.
Like
so there's Starkey's, there's ours.
Yeah.
There are 3 authors in this book, as you've mentioned, myself, Peter, Hans Martin. That leaves us in the happy situation that if there's any problems, if there are any errors, I will just blame the other 2, and I'm sure they will do the same if you put any hard questions to them. What we're aiming for in the book is really comprehensiveness. So we're looking at airport demand, passenger forecasting. We're looking particularly, of course, at costs, as you would expect. What cost structure has that industry? We're looking at pricing, which is an obvious topic for economists, but journalists and a lot of others will just not see the connection between efficient use of capacity and pricing. We're looking at the ownership, the way that has changed over recent decades, and whether that has produced a change in performance, which is a controversial subject. There's a rather long chapter, even a very long chapter, on competition and regulation, which tries to cover all that ground very thoroughly. And then we finish up really with looking at environmental issues, both from a noise and from a carbon emissions point of view. And then we sum up the recent controversies in the industry, the recent challenges, and try and look ahead as well. I would describe the structure of each chapter in the following terms. We present the economics of each of these issues. Now, this audience won't think so, but other audiences will say, really? Is there really economics about all of these things? So what we aim to do, first of all, is to show that there is an economic analysis that can be presented. We then work on from that to what would be the logical policy if the goal is the public interest and the goal is efficient use of the facilities. We then have a look at prevailing policy, which unsurprisingly deviates a long way from what's recommended, and we are hoping that one of the effects of the book might be to get consideration given to some changes and some improvements there. Maybe that's hoping for a lot. One of the final feature of the book that I would mention is in each of the chapters, we illustrate we illustrate a topic that the analysis in that chapter can be used to shed some light on. So, for example, we've seen controversies about an additional runway in Heathrow. We take basically an example from each of the topics in each of the chapters, and therefore by looking at that example, we think it'll clarify what the economic analysis at an earlier point in the chapter has had to say. So I can leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Carl. Thank you. Let me ask you the same question I asked Marina. If I worked in an airline, not as a pilot, not as a flyer or anything like that, if I worked in an airline in the regulatory sort of area, the policy area, why would I be buying this book?
So I think a lot of readers of the book, including the group you've identified, will find some parts of the book relevant. So the chapter on competition and regulation, for example, will be important to them. I think for airlines, the question of efficient use of airport infrastructure and avoiding premature building and costs, which then fall onto the airlines, will be an example. It's open to the reader of a given chapter, I think, to scrutinize some parts more than others and to take from the parts of the chapter what's relevant to themselves. One might think, of course, that airlines are maybe not always the most helpful stakeholders when it comes to airport efficiency, but I leave that to the reader to decide for themselves. So I think there's a wide group of people who will be interested in part of the book.
Okay, and so then if I worked in an ATM organisation, would there be bits of it relevant to me as well?
Well, I think indirectly. Plainly, ATM interacts both with airlines, but certainly with airports, particularly issues like slot efficiency, the airport's decisions, the airlines' decisions, and certainly the air traffic management decisions all interact there. So it's not simply airport pricing that will cause the runway to be used well. The rules that the ATM system imposes can be helpful or less helpful, and those kind of connections might be apparent to someone in ATM.
This is perhaps a little bit
discovered.
This is perhaps a little bit out of left field, but do you think airports should be in charge of the control tower at each airport?
I think in both cases, the airport case and the air traffic control service, what really matters is whether the suppliers of both of those services are subject to as much competition as we can arrange. So how broad the set of services the airport provides seems to me less relevant than the efficiency which will be the result of competition.
Right. So if I may, and I'm almost sort of segueing into our next book, but I got the impression from your introduction, Cathal, that that a lot of this you see is actually policy. It's a policy issue. It's how we as individuals, how we as states and governments and what have you choose to regulate these things.
Yeah, I mean, airports are very expensive pieces of infrastructure. They're crucial economically. Making good use of them is important. And it's, predominantly a policy question. But to devise the good policy, you need to understand the economics of the airport.
Right. Gee, that's breaking with the habits of a lifetime in aviation to do that, I think. But okay. And one final question for you: is there a generous discount code available as well?
Oh yes. So when the time comes to make this presentation, which I think Peter will be doing, there's a 30% discount that we'll be telling everybody about.
So this, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, is where policy interacts with economics. If you ask the right question, you can get a generous discount code, which is always a good thing. Okay, thank you very much, Carl. Thank you for everyone. Our next book, I'm moving now on to you, Barry, if I may. Our next book is by Barry Humphries. It's called The Regulation of Air Transport. It's a book, if I may say, I think long overdue, and Barry has written some really excellent pieces for publication and other things as well, talking about it. Barry, if you'd be so kind as to give me 5 minutes about the book and why we should be reading it, and then we'll have a couple of questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. I'm not an academic, so this book writing business is all new to me. And I noticed you mentioned amusingly at the beginning that my book was the pinnacle. I assume by that you meant that I've got the furthest to fall when nobody likes my book. Well,
it's twice as long as all the others. It's twice as long as all the others. So is that too?
It wasn't supposed to be, but I just couldn't stop writing. Anyway, I've only got 5 minutes, so let me start. The book is divided into two parts, really. The first part looks at the development of aviation regulation, going all the way back to the Chicago Conference. And I make no apology for making this quite an historical approach for two main reasons. One is I really do believe that you can't solve today's problems unless you understand how those problems have arisen. And secondly, many of today's issues that face the aviation industry, and especially the airlines, really do date back all the way to the 1940s, and nothing has fundamentally changed in that. And I describe why that is the case in some detail. Just to show I can't count, the third of my 2 points is that when talking to students, I'm always amazed how little they really know about the history of aviation, and I think it'd be jolly good for them to learn a bit more, but that's by the side. The second half of the book examines in some detail many of today's problems. It focuses on airlines, but also has chapters on airports and ATC, and other chapters cover the environment, technology, airline profitability, airline ownership and control, and finally the impact of COVID and looking to the future prospects. One key theme of the book is that the airline business in particular is a failed industry. It's often been said that the airlines have destroyed more capital than they've created since the Wright brothers, and that's probably roughly true. It has been, and it remains today, hopelessly loss-making. IATA, just before the COVID outbreak, and at a time when the airlines, like today, were really doing quite well financially, IATA produced a review showing that there were only 30 airlines in the world that were truly profitable in terms of covering their cost of capital. And of course, it's an industry that has been kept going, not so much by its own efforts as by government bailouts and Chapter 11 type bankruptcy. And I look in a lot of detail as to why this is so, and I argue that the prime reason goes all the way back to the 40s and the decision to impose tight ownership and control rules on airlines, which has prevented cross-border consolidation that we have seen in so many other industries. And the proof of the pudding seems to me to be what has happened in the United States, where there has been consolidation and the US airlines have been transformed from basket cases, basically the biggest loss makers in the airline business, to now to becoming the most profitable, certainly among the most profitable. So as I mentioned, the book goes into a lot of detail. It's a very difficult problem to solve, of course. You need a multilateral agreement, and that, as we all know, is almost impossible. The negotiations between the European Union and the US offered the great hope for success, but they failed, and there doesn't seem to be any hope on the horizon. And the book covers all of that in some detail. If I've got a minute left, just a few words on the future. I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic about the future of the aviation industry for a number of reasons. One is the ownership and control rules, which I've just mentioned. I don't see any fundamental change in them, and I think despite the nibbling away at the edges that we've seen, that they will continue to act as a restraint on profitability. The second factor is the environment. We all know that's probably the big issue facing the industry at the moment. And what that means is that things are going to get a lot more expensive. And the issue that the initiatives being taken to deal with the environment almost all come at a higher cost. Higher costs mean higher fares means less demand than you would have had before. Third item, increased protectionism. That my book is actually called Regulation of Air Transport from Protection to Liberalisation and Back Again. It was supposed to have a question mark at the end, but the publisher told me you couldn't have a question mark in a title. So the point is that we're seeing a growing trend against the progress that has been made on the liberalisation front, and aviation in this respect is mirroring what is happening in all industries. We see the anti-globalization trend and the growth of protectionism, and protectionism means less consumer welfare, higher fares, etc. Finally, COVID. We've seen with COVID greater government intervention, which again is not necessarily a good thing, and it goes against the trend of recent decades, and also far higher debt incurred by the airlines, which is going to have important implications. So overall, quite a pessimistic outlook for the industry. I think that's 5 minutes, more or less.
Well, give or take. To what extent is it the Chicago Convention itself of 44, and to what extent then is it the sort of the Bermuda agreements 45, 46, 47 that sort of came along after that? That's my first question.
No, I think that's all part of the same package. Actually.
So you think it's
it's
the Chicago system, if you like?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. But so again, back to the same old question that I've asked everyone else. If I worked for an airline, why would I buy your book?
Because it covers a significant proportion of the issues that airlines and indeed airports and ATC deal with on a day-to-day basis. You name some of the big issues that, say, a manager of regulation would have to deal with, or slots, environment, ATC delays, and so forth. They're all covered in there, so you definitely should buy it. I aimed the book very much at people in the industry. I mean, the publisher obviously was quite keen that we aimed at the student population who buy lots of books, but personally, I aimed it very much at what the people who used to be my colleagues in the aviation business, and hopefully they could learn a little bit from it.
Right.
If that's not too precocious.
No, not at all. But it did spark in me a memory. I once spoke to when Gatwick Airport was originally privatised away from BAA and what have you, and it was taken over by Infrastructure Partners or whatever it was called. They all of a sudden introduced some incredibly innovative pricing structures. They paid no attention to the ICAO rules and what have you. And I had a long conversation with the guy who was responsible for introducing and then negotiating those rates with various people. And he said to me, every single person within the airlines to whom he spoke had the word regulation in their title. Right. So how do we move from regulatory to commercial? I got the impression, Barry, you're quite pessimistic about that.
Yeah, I am. And actually, I'm going to answer your question indirectly, I think. So I hope I capture it. But one thing that used to drive me mad, both when I was a regulator and an airline executive, was the short-termism of managers. They very rarely were able to sit back and take a broader view of issues. And I thought that was very negative from the interests of their own companies in many respects. I can give you examples of that. And hopefully my book helps in that because it presents the bigger picture. So I'm not sure I've quite answered your question, but that's something I really wanted to focus on.
You have. I mean, and of course, you know that this is exactly the area of my keenest interest. So I'm going to just stretch 1 minute indulgently. At the moment, you mentioned it, I think Cathal mentioned it, this constant squeeze on costs, because that way we get more passengers thing. Haven't we seen that collapse as a theory in the last little while with things like the NATS outage, where we just didn't have enough spare capacity? We didn't have the capacity to recover. And again, with the COVID outbreak at the Gatwick Tower, where suddenly we don't have enough spare reserves in there. We're always running at 99.9%. Isn't there a place for intelligent regulation that actually allows the system to be significantly more robust?
Well, I actually think the two examples you've quoted are not very good examples. I think.
Thanks for that. No, don't hold that.
I think that we could debate that for an hour or two. But you're obviously, in principle, you're right. You need robustness in the system. But I think airlines, in particular, and airports as well, are well aware of that. I mean, the issues. At the end of the day, this is a commercial business and they're there to serve the consumer. And what does the consumer want? The consumer wants, above everything else, low costs. You know, they complain about the space between the seats, but they're not prepared to pay an extra penny to get it, to get more space, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not surprised that the airlines focus on cutting costs. Commercially, it's absolutely the right thing to do, but it has to be done in a sensible way. And in my experience, most of them do that. It's when you get to governments, I think, you run into problems. They are much less likely to take a sensible approach on that. And their idea of cost cutting is to exploit everything down to the minimum level. So that's where the problems arise, in my opinion.
Right. So speaking of cost cutting, my final question, Barry, of course, a generous discount code is available for people who are on this call, right?
It will be when I get round to sorting it. Yes, yes. Somebody has asked me to repeat the title of the book, which I will do with pleasure. It's called The Regulation of Air Transport: From Protection to Liberalisation and Back Again.
Question mark.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Barry. I'm looking forward to it. Indeed, it's Barry and I who will be talking about this on the 10th of October. So the next book is about benchmarking as a means to regulate airports. It's a Springer publication rather than a Rutledge one, and it's been written by a veritable roll call of the great and the good in Aviation Economics, Peter Forsyth, Jürgen Müller, Hans-Martin Neumeyer, Eric Pells, Darren Bigger, Nicole Adler, and Cahal again. And I think I'm looking to you, Peter, aren't I,
Yes,
if you'd be so kind as to introduce it. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Andrew. Now, just to give you the title the title and the authors, you just mentioned that I'm involved as an editor, along with Jürgen Müller and Hans-Martin Niemeyer and Eric Pells, and we are the editors. And we've drawn upon a whole group of people, including Cahal and I think Nicole and a few other people who are here to do this book. So it's an edited book, which is really a sort of handbook on economic regulation of airports. That's what it's all about. So years gone by, about 20 years ago, GARS brought out a book on economic regulation of airports. And there have been various changes since, and we thought it was about time to have another look. And so we're putting forward this other, and it's not an updated version of the original book, it's a new book. Okay, so we thought it was time to update, and here we are. So it's quite a comprehensive book. It's quite small. It's only about 450 pages, and there are about 20 chapters. So we're not going to go through each of those tonight, or indeed later on. However, to give you a bit of an idea of where we went, first of all, we have a look at general topics. And we start with looking at how competitive the airport market is and whether there's a need for regulation. And so if you're going to have regulation, what types of regulation do you want to have? Do you want to have, say, price caps? Or do you want to go for light-handed regulation, which you've got in Australia and New Zealand and a few other places, and so on? And then we look at some other specific questions, looking at slots and the relationship of regulation and slots, and the problem of investment when the airport is regulated. How will that be handled and so forth? So that's the sort of first part of the book. Second part, I think, is a bit of a highlight, and that deals with the use of benchmarking in regulation. And the idea is, of course, that benchmarking can be very useful to regulators. And so we decided to have in our discussion in a few weeks' time, we'll have Darren Bigger, who used to work at the Australian Competition Regulation, who did a chapter, and Cahal and Nicole, who all did chapters in the book. And so they are going to have a discussion of the use of, the problems of benchmarking and the use of it and so forth. And then we've got a third section, which is basically a series of country studies, starting off, of course, with the United Kingdom and going through Germany, France, Netherlands, and a number of other European countries, and including Latin American countries. And so all in all, that gives you a bit of a flavor of the book. And so hopefully this will add up to basically an up-to-date handbook on airport regulation. So thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. So my standard question, if I'm working in an airline, why would this book be interesting to me?
Okay. Now, they would have people who are specifically concerned about airport regulation. So they might be in an airport such as Frankfurt or Heathrow, or they're working from there. And they, at least somebody in those airlines would be particularly concerned about the various ways in which airports are being regulated, so that they can compare with what's going on in Heathrow to Frankfurt or to Dublin or wherever. And so you've got that. And then they're also interested, I think, from a broader perspective, looking at sort of what some of these alternative systems might be, such as light-handed regulation, et cetera, et cetera. And so you find that airlines get very interested in the various reports on airport regulation. And that becomes a very topical thing when there's some sort of report, when perhaps a price cap is being renewed and so forth.
Right. Yeah. So benchmark, I mean, from an airport perspective, a book about benchmarking allows literally for comparing what my airport's doing versus what other airports are doing. I mean, that's hardly groundbreaking. To what extent is benchmarking anything other than universal, though, Peter, around the world? Why isn't every airport on Earth doing it?
I think a lot do, but they're rather cagey about it. And they tend to benchmark with other airports that they think are similar, but also are not too much better than themselves. So,
gee, gaming the regulatory system, that doesn't happen.
Indeed. And so they were able to say, oh, well, we've done a benchmarking study and we came out first or second. Terrific. And so that's something that they will do. Now, somebody, say the regulator, might say, aha, that's great, but what about all these other airports that you haven't mentioned? According to our studies, you're a lot less efficient than them, and so on.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
so I mean, I am very conscious of giving everyone some equal amounts of time. But let me ask a benchmarking question of you, Peter. I've been doing a benchmarking here today, and every other book is offering me a generous discount. Does your book? Are you offering a generous discount in this book for listeners?
Now, I was just going to pass on to Hans Martin. Have we got a discount yet?
I pass that on to the other editors, but we'll find out.
Right.
I think I don't like this question. I mean, what you are intending is a price war. I mean, we are not that stupid.
No, I'm benchmarking, Hans-Martin, not a price war.
We are not stupid like airlines and compete over price. We are not so stupid. So we offer different products at very low prices.
So you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. You heard it here first. You can always tell an economist he's got a fancy answer for everything. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Hans Martin. Let's move on to Mike Brown, and Mike's book is called Strategic Airport Planning, which I guess means it's only about planning for strategic airports. So, Mike, I guess my first question for you is: are there unstrategic airports, and why are they around? But that said, please tell us what's your book. Your book's about. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. When you look at books on airport planning, you see a lot of straight lines. There are straight line demand forecasts, and there's neat geometry of runways and taxiways and terminal buildings. And this book doesn't have straight lines in it. It's actually about curves and inflection points. The strategic is simply a lens to say a lot of airport strategic plans have very grandiose statements in them, like we want to be the greenest airport in North America, or the most cost-efficient airport in Australia, or offer the best customer service of any airport in Europe. And that's all well and good for public consumption, but real strategy is looking at the fundamental, the existential threats and opportunities that are facing you, and crafting, a series of actions to, mitigate the downside and take advantage of the upside. And I use the old American, fast, cheap, or good, right? Pick two. And there's a great example of Austin Airport, Texas, that tried to do all three, the classic trilemma. Three desirable outcomes, of which only two are possible. So part of the book is encouraging airports to be precise and rigorous in their strategy development. And that's even more important after COVID, when we've got some real challenges and a new normal emerging. The inflection points is, when you look at sort of technology or business and the trend over time, you generally see an S curve, right, with inflection points. And, you go back to 1987 and the movie Wall Street with Gordon Gekko as the evil Wall Street financier talking to his sorcerer's apprentice, Charlie Sheen, on a brick-sized mobile phone. And then, 20 years later, everybody's got a phone, right? So one of the things I try and convey in the book is how airport planners and strategists need to think about the inflection points. When is the next inflection point coming? Is it up, down, sideways? And what can you do to accelerate it if it's positive, or mitigate it if it's negative? And I use Manchester Airport as an example. Manchester Airport in England, in 1985, 86, had an inflection point where its growth rate stepped up. Now, this might have been the release of the Happy Mondays first album and the start of the great Manchester music scene. It might have been Sir Alex Ferguson becoming the manager at Manchester United. But it was also when Ryanair, this unknown, small, scrappy carrier, started flying between the UK and Ireland for £20, as opposed to £200 being charged by the duopoly of Aer Lingus and British Airways. And then we also had ETOPS, where all of a sudden, smaller long-range aircraft could fly across the Atlantic. So thinner, smaller routes like Boston, Manchester, or Toronto, Manchester became viable. So one of the invocations of the book for planners and forecasters is think about inflection points. And they come from many things: air carrier strategy, government regulation, open skies versus a more restrictive bilateral regime, exchange rates. Any number of things can cause an inflection. Just back to Manchester, so things were going swimmingly until 2005. And then British Airways, as air carriers tend to do in times of economic trouble in the great financial crisis, said, we can't afford to have a secondary hub at Manchester. And they retreated to the fortress Heathrow, and Manchester lost about 5 million passengers. So part of the book is really about process, and there's a process for forecasting, there's a process for planning. Then I get into, another set of inflection points, which is the coefficients by which we translate demand into capacity are always changing. So if you look at, terminal buildings that were planned at the end of the last century, the first decade of this century, you generally see these massive vaulted check-in halls, Toronto Pearson, Hong Kong, because the planners assumed everybody was going to check in. Well, of course, nobody checks in now at the airport. So the other sort of the other invocation in the book in terms of inflection points is how is the coefficient by which you translate a certain level of demand into capacity changing? And it's, with the revolution going on in artificial intelligence and AI and biometric touchless travel, there's some real implications there. So I'm attached to Imperial College, as you probably know, where we do benchmarking for 9 of the big airports in the world. I'm happy to chat with the authors of the benchmarking book about that in due course. But we coined a phrase in the pandemic that airports are going to have to come back cleaner, greener, leaner, and keener. So the cleaner is obviously public expectations of, cleanliness in public places have gone up because of COVID, but it also speaks to touchless travel. The revolution that we're seeing in touchless travel, with Hong Kong arguably being the leaders in this, but it's quickly coming to an airport near you. The greener, obviously, is the emissions issue and getting to net zero. And for airports, it's all about airside. The bulk of an airport's emissions happen as airport taxi from terminals to runways. The leaner is margins are getting compressed. Capital is getting more expensive. Operating costs are up. The non-aeronautical revenue yield was declining even before COVID, as disruptors came into the market, such as you park your car at Melbourne Airport for 2 weeks and it goes into a rental pool like an Airbnb. So the yields are falling in revenue, and margins are being pressurized. And then the keener is sort of talking about how airports have always broadcast and reported their economic impacts. But COVID revealed some fairly ugly fissures in our society.
Sure did.
Particularly low-wage
Mike,
workers.
I'm going to have to interrupt here. My normal insult for people who go too long is to say, "Is this coming out as a book?" But of course, in this case, the answer to that is yes.
I apologize for running over.
No, not at all. But I've got a couple of questions. All these inflection points. As an Australian, I try very hard not to talk about black swan events as if somehow black swans are unusual, because, as Margaret and others on this call can tell you, where we come from, and Peter, black swans are the normals, not the unusuals. But inflection points, almost by definition, can't be foreseen, can they?
Well, I would draw a distinction between a black swan event and an inflection point. A black swan event is a COVID, right? An inflection point is a change in air carrier strategy. It is a change in government regulation. Suddenly, mass tourism from China is allowed through the approved destination status that countries were bestowed.
But they are as unpredictable or as unforeseeable.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, obviously forecasting is always, has an element of that hazard in it. But indeed, government, airports lobby actively for inflection points that will be in their interest. Like, we want more tourists from China. We want more liberal. We want aircraft to be able to fly to our airport from more places with less regulation.
Right.
So,
but I still think, the Happy Mondays first album was completely unforeseeable. But there you go. I've obviously got one final question to put to you, which is something to do with the generous discount code. But I've had my fingers very badly burnt by Hans Martin now. Where do we get
tough
your
crowd? Tough crowd.
Yeah, I'll say.
Well, it's on the Routledge website. It's on Amazon. I am in the process of chatting with the publisher about a discount associated with my seminar in a couple of weeks.
Excellent.
So,
well, you've heard it. You've heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. And the seminar, incidentally, is on the 13th of November at 1 in the afternoon, 1300 Central European time. Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Last, but by no means least, I'd like to ask David Starkey, if he'd be so pleased or so kind as to introduce his book, which is about airport enterprises and economic analysis. It's from the Regulatory Policy Institute. And David, if you'd tell us all about that, I'd be very grateful. You're on mute, David. You're on mute. I wondered how long we'd go through this before I had to say that. We nearly made it to the
end. Andrew, Hans probably told you I'm very deaf these days, but so I need to wear these. However, when I wear these, I can't speak very well. So I'm going to take these off, and when my time's up, just give me the thumbs up or wave to me. Okay? Right. I guess you can all still... This book, well, actually, I want to just make a plug for Barry Humphrey's book. I think I'm allowed to do this because his was published first a few months ago. And it so happens it's one of the contenders here that I have read throughout, and it's an extremely good book. So there's a plug for Barry. I don't know whether he's still here. He's not on my screen anymore, but anyhow, there we are.
The check's in the post, David. Okay?
My book, Airport Enterprises. I'll get straight away to the pricing. I'm the low-cost entrant, I think, in this. I came into the picture fairly late on. 30th of August actually was publication date. I think after most, if not all of the others, and it's very very sharply priced, shall we say. The ebook is available, and it's incidentally 240 pages, so it's not a thin tome. But the ebook is for £9.99, whatever that translates at into euros or Aussie dollars, I don't know. The print version is £29.99 sterling. And importantly, it's available on Amazon. There we I'm afraid, Hans, sorry to, you made a very good point though, Hans, I think. How does my book differ from the conventional airport economics approach? It differs because most airport economic writings in general tend to come at airports as an industry, as a public enterprise industry, as public utilities, and therefore subject to welfare economics. And I not coming at it through that particular lens. I'm coming at it from a commercial perspective, or trying to adopt a more commercial perspective. And in fact, I preface things in the book by making the point, I don't think welfare economics is necessarily a very good tool for analysing not just airports, but also airlines as well. And this is because the that are not paying ultimately the taxes when there is a subsidy involved. And therefore I tend to, I find a lot of the tools of welfare economics very useful, but it does come with that very important caveat. And that's another reason why I've tried to switch the whole perspective towards a commercial approach. Apart from that, you find, I think, quite a number of contentious chapters in the book. I take a very contrary view on productivity functions in airports. I don't believe or accept rather the standard view about airports and huge lumpiness and economies of scale. I really do question that very seriously. And I also question the whole point about entry and contestability. The argument that it is very difficult. Well, it is very difficult, but it's not quite so difficult as it's often painted. And my final point I'll make, Andrew, because we are running out of time, is to actually anticipate one of your questions about why airlines should buy this book. Airlines, most of them, they're protecting their game. And it so happens that one of the chapters, chapter 11, is rather critical. I argue in that chapter, and I can elaborate at the end of November. I argue in that chapter that the way we look at slots at airports and scarcity rents is inappropriate. And I use data for Heathrow. Sorry, I've had a bad cold and my voice is going. I used data for Heathrow to suggest that airlines actually are really operating oligopolistically, can't even say it, and not as they in the fashion they pretend to do. So at that point, I'll stop with 1 minute to go.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I know you can't now hear me saying thank you to you, and thank you for answering the question. We have a minute to go, which gives me time, I think, to do two things. And the first thing, ladies and gentlemen, is to remind you that at 1 o'clock Central European time next week, the 16th of October, we are starting the deep dives in each of these books, and we're starting with Marina. And talking about ATM and ATM principles and so forth. And then after that, we'll be talking about airport economics, the regulation of air transport, benchmarking in aviation, strategic airport planning, and then finally David's airport enterprises thing. And I thought all of those introductions were terrific, and I'm very, very grateful for everyone doing it.